Oh, hello, Mark. How are you?
Hi, Stuart. Good to see you again. Good to hear you again.
And you. When I bumped into you a couple of weeks ago, I didn't have time to talk to you, and I wanted to talk to you about some stuff, about our hearing. So, before I get onto that, how have you been?
I'm very well, actually. Thank you. Yeah, absolutely brilliant. Sort of things are working out really well, and obviously it's brilliant to be able to talk to you today using my cochlear implants. That's the main highlight for me, isn't it?
Well, it wouldn't be possible, would it, without our cochlear
No,
implants? So it's
exactly.
really good point there. Yeah, really good point. I've written down a couple of things I'd like to talk to you about because I think before we talk about what we started talking about a couple of weeks ago, because I really want to talk to you a bit more about that. For anyone watching this video, can you just tell us a little bit about how you lost your hearing, if you know the cause? Just tell us a little bit about that first.
Sure, absolutely, no problem. So, so I was born with normal hearing, and at age 4, I got meningitis. So I went very quickly from having good, excellent hearing to having not so much. So that was obviously a little bit traumatic, particularly for my parents, dealing with a child that probably sort of didn't understand what had happened to them. And the overriding memory for me is the hearing aids I had to wear in the 1970s. I don't know if you remember them, but I mean, you're obviously a lot younger than I am. But the ones with the dangly wires down to the box.
I've heard about them.
Right, and the thing I relate to most is I used to chew the wires, and I still remember the taste of those wires. Isn't that weird? Isn't that weird?
Okay.
I lost my.
Don't try this at home, folks.
No, exactly. So it's a surprise I didn't get a lot of electric shocks that way. But anyway, so it was so from the age 4, I had to wear hearing aids, and started with one hearing aid, then progressed to 2. For those of you that know, meningitis, it's kind of obviously it damages the hairs in the cochlea. So I still had some hearing, but obviously as I got older, and particularly into my teens and into my adult life, I started to really need lip reading and really needed to, sort of go to 2 hearing aids, turn the volume right up, and really sort of transition almost from being able to hear a little bit to just being able to hear muffles, and then relying on lip reading to get through. And that was kind of my 20s, and certainly my early 30s continued in that way.
Okay, so when for you, you provided a really quick story there, but when for you was the moment that you learned about cochlear implants for the first time, or believed you needed a cochlear implant?
I mean, it's interesting. I never really thought, first of all, that they were the things for me. So I always kind of had this impression that they were for people who were completely deaf, and I guess particularly in my 20s and my 30s, I kind of sort of convinced myself that I'm fine. I'm kind of dealing with things. Yes, I have to lip read a lot, and it takes a lot of energy. But when it's like anything, when you get used to it and it's part of your normal everyday life, you just kind of get on with it, don't you? And also the sort of the perception of cochlear implants was that there was this big thing on the side of your head, and they have to cut your head open, and it was just a very, very serious big thing. So I never really kind of thought it was an option. And it was only when I was getting into, I would say, into my 30s, and also the trigger for me was becoming a dad as well. So I became a dad, and I thought, you know what, I absolutely want to be able to hear my son. I want to be able to. I don't want to miss those things. I want to be able to sort of chat to him when he's in the back of the car, and I want to be able to hear him for safety's sake, and all those things. So it was a combination of kind of work stresses along with becoming a dad. I thought, okay, I need to look into this more seriously. And it was only at that point that I started doing some research and started to go down the NHS route of, okay, what am I candidate first of all, and then what does that mean? What's the process? It took, I would say, 2 or 3 years of of kind of thinking about it, talking about it, trying to understand it, because it's a big decision. And you know, and when, particularly when you've been coping, and I use that word very loosely, when you've been coping and your career is progressing and you seem to be, your family is supportive, it's very easy to kind of go, well, do you know what, you know, the grass isn't always greener, maybe I'm just fine where I am. But ultimately, as I said, the trigger was, you know, I could see career-wise I needed to do something, and also my son being born. So that it was at that point that I kind of started going down the route. And yeah, it took a while, but I convinced myself to take the leap, and thank God I did. That's all I can say.
Yeah, I mean, there's two things there that you really point out, which is career and family, and they're both very important. So, you know, thank God we live in this day and age where we actually have a solution for our kinds of hearing loss. It's before I talk to you about your first experiences with the cochlear implant, can you give us an example of when or why or how, a situation where you felt quite low before you had your cochlear implant? Does anything come to mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think it relates to my career more than anything else. I mean, I remember sitting in, so my job is I'm basically a project manager. So my job is to manage people, to manage clients, to manage, you know, sort of, a project and a plan and everything else. So a lot of that, in fact, all of that is all about communication. So, which is ironic, really, where for someone who kind of, you know, chose a career path that perhaps they weren't physically set up that well for it. But you know, I like to think I was doing well in my career. But I remember sitting in a meeting in London with a client and my team, and you know, I think you know what it's like when you're lip reading. You're playing table tennis, you know, you're playing tennis, you're watching the room, you're looking at people's lips. I'm sitting at a big table trying to keep up with what everyone's saying, and it's exhausting. And I kind of I thought to myself, yeah, I can't keep doing this. This is just, you know, why am I putting myself through this? I mean, having client meetings and driving meetings is stressful enough, but when you're having to do that on top of it, it's so I think that was probably, I wouldn't say it was necessarily a particularly low moment, but it was certainly a moment where I thought to myself, you know, I just, look, yeah, I can't keep doing this for another 20 years. You know, I've either got to change job and do something different, which would be a real wrench for me because I'd sort of put so much into my career, or I need to do something else, and that something else ultimately proved to be cochlear implants. But I never, if I'm really brutally honest about it, I never ever thought with cochlear implants that I would get the result that I got. So if I'd known at that stage or earlier that I would have had, you know, a sort of the results I got, or even half the result that I've got, right? Yeah. It would have been a complete no-brainer. And so that was the real sort of realization for me. And it's something that, and I know everybody gets a different outcome, but it's quite a sort of a contrast, I think, when I sort of talk to people about my experiences, that actually, you know, the technology has got to a point now where, you know, you're likely to get a good outcome. It's you know, there, and obviously the way that the NHS deals with it and centres deal with it, they never put someone forward for an implant if they don't think you've got a really good chance of getting at least an improvement. Yeah. And so that was probably my low point in terms of realization that something needed to change.
Mm-hmm. And I can relate to that, because I remember being in the classroom and, you know, the fluorescent lighting and lip reading all day. And I think what you were describing there is the fatigue that people with hearing loss know too well. Yeah, very familiar with. And you spoke earlier about what people thought about cochlear implants, but I'm interested in learning about what your first experience of, what was your first impression?
What you mean after I had them? Yeah.
So I mean, we've done some videos on the surgery, so I don't think we need to cover that again. But let's get to your activation and your experience of cochlear implants. So, tell us something about that.
Okay. Yeah, so I mean, it was not the light bulb moment. So when they switch you on, they, people think, oh, I'm going to be able to hear again. I got the beeps and whistles when I was switched on, which was very weird, and it was very very kind of unusual. I had my mum in the room when I had my switch on, which was somewhat underwhelming, but it was good after 6 weeks of waiting in silence to be switched on at last. And then obviously they sent me away and said, go away and do some listening, Mark. And I was like, oh, okay. So we traveled home, and I remember being, there's a sort of couple of reflections in the early stages. One was standing on the platform and actually being able to hear snippets of the announcements, of the next train to wherever. And I was asking my mum, is that what they said? I didn't get all of it, but I got bits of it, and it was just like, blimey, this was an hour after being switched on. I was thinking, okay, this is very strange. And then I would say the next one was a sort of, and then we kind of we got in the car, drove home, and I was saying, well, what's that noise, Mum? And it was actually the rain on the window. It was rain on the the windshield. And I didn't quite know what it was, but there was something there. So from the very early stages, it was okay, something's happening here, and you could almost feel your brain trying to sort of understand what's coming in. So that was the kind of really early stages, and then really actually what it was I realised very quickly that, and I was very fortunate because my company gave me the time off to rehabilitate. So not only had I been off for the surgery, obviously, but they then gave me time off to kind of recuperate, but also sort of start to learn to hear again. And that's the kind of thing that I then threw myself into, in terms of starting to think, okay, well, how am I going to do that? Yes, you can go out and listen to the birds and the bees, and you can chat with your family and all those kind of things, but actually, what can I do to kind of almost train my brain? Because effectively what you're doing is, as you know, you're teaching your brain to hear again. Yeah,
absolutely. When you were talking, then I had a bit of a flashback myself, because I know that we were implanted at the same centre.
Yeah.
And I had exactly the same experience, where I went to the train station and I was listening to all the announcements. It's exactly the same thing. So it's
wow.
That's 20 years ago. It's just come back to me. So
wow. So yeah, I mean, and I guess the sort of key takeaway for me, you asked me about what some of my experiences were. Well, the key takeaway for me was training my brain again, and some of the techniques that I'm sure you used and I used was around using audiobooks. So kind of having some headphones on, or actually I think I used Direct Connect, which was a way of connecting to my device through an MP3 player, and then just having a basic audiobook. I think lots of it was Agatha Christie, which was really exciting stuff, with an Agatha Christie book in front of me, and knowing which chapter I was on, and basically just trying to follow the words. And actually I was quite surprised with how quickly I could do that. And it was that training of the brain that I spent a fair amount of time on. And the final thing I would say was I remember the first time my mum said something to me. I was over at her house, and she was helping me with some of the training, and I wasn't in the room, and she was outside the room, and she mentioned something. She said to about, because we used to live in Australia when I was younger, and she mentioned, I don't know what the topic of the conversation was, but she mentioned something about going to McDonald's with my brother in Australia for the first time, and I heard every word she said, and it was like, and I'll remember that now, 20 years later. I can still remember it, and I'm sure you're the same. It's kind of those really sort of like pivotal moments in your journey.
Yeah, it's so how many weeks after activation was that McDonald's conversation?
I would say probably less than a week. Probably wow. Sort of, I would say probably sort of 5 or 6 days after activation.
I think it is important to point out now, like you said before, outcomes are very different for lots of people, but that is incredible. It really is. And you were talking just now about audiobooks, and I think that's a really, really good topic to focus on, because that's what I really wanted to talk to you about today. I wanted to talk to you about what kinds of things did you do to actually push yourself, to actually train the brain. And I agree with you, listening to speech in isolation is where it starts, because that's all we want. We want to be able to understand other people. We want to communicate. We want to collaborate. And it starts with speech and understanding speech. But then it gets more complicated after that. So after the audiobooks, what other things might you have done to, learn the sounds of the world?